Nobody sat in Matteo Viscari's chair. Not executives, not guards, not even the cleaning staff dared to sit there when they polished that dark wooden desk after midnight. That chair belonged to the man who had controlled Viscari Holdings and half the city's criminal underworld for nearly a decade, without ever raising his voice or cracking a smile. That morning, Clara Bennett sat in it. She crossed one leg over the other, lowered her voice, and stared down a terrified junior accountant standing in front of the desk. "The coffee arrived 30 seconds late," Clara said, copying Matteo's cold, flat tone. "Clearly, the entire building must be replaced." 3 employees near the door covered their mouths, trying not to laugh. Clara grew bolder. She lifted Matteo's silver pen and pointed it at the desk lamp. "And this lamp has been leaning suspiciously to the left. Disloyalty always starts with small movements." Someone laughed out loud. Clara turned toward the young accountant, the one who had nearly cried after entering the wrong number in a weekly report. "Your mistake cost this company $12.40, Clara said gravely. "Naturally, I will now stare at you until your ancestors apologize." The whole office broke. Quiet laughter spread from desk to desk. For the first time that morning, the frightened accountant actually smiled. Then every sound in the room stopped dead. Matteo Viscari was standing right behind Clara. His black coat was still damp from the rain outside. 2 guards waited a few steps behind him, wearing the kind of expression you'd expect right before an execution. Clara slowly set the pen down on the desk. She turned around in Matteo's chair and looked up at him. Nobody in that office moved a muscle. "Before we go further, tell us where you're watching from. And be honest. If you'd just been caught mocking the most feared mafia boss in the city, sitting in his own chair, would you apologize? Or would you claim the chair made you do it?" Clara rose to her feet, bracing herself. She expected Matteo to fire her on the spot. Instead, his eyes drifted from the leaning lamp to the accountant and finally back to her. "Did you just accuse my furniture of betrayal?" Clara considered lying her way out of it. Unfortunately, 12 witnesses were watching. "The lamp looked guilty," she said. A sound escaped Matteo. Quiet at first, almost like a breath he couldn't hold back. Then he laughed. The entire office froze harder than before. One guard glanced at the other, as if silently asking whether they should call a doctor. Matteo braced one hand against the desk, his shoulders shaking once before he forced the laughter down. Clara had worked as his executive secretary for 11 months. She had seen him angry. She had seen him exhausted. She had seen him go silent in ways that could terrify an entire room. She had never once seen him amused. Neither had anyone else. For 9 years, Matteo Viscari had not laughed. The humor drained from his face almost as fast as it appeared. Something darker took its place. He looked at the empty chair as though the laughter itself had betrayed him more deeply than Clara's little performance ever could. Then he ordered everyone back to work. Clara assumed he'd walk away. Instead, he told her to follow him into his private office. The door closed behind them. Matteo stood by the window watching the rain hit the glass. Clara stayed near the door, clutching her notebook to her chest. She apologized for sitting in his chair, for touching his pen, for turning his entire management style into office entertainment. Matteo asked why she'd done it. Clara explained that Daniel, the junior accountant, had made an honest mistake and genuinely believed Matteo was about to end his career over it. He'd been panicking. "So you mocked me. I distracted him. You called my lamp disloyal. It was the strongest part of the performance." Matteo almost smiled again. He caught himself. Clara noticed. The room had no family photos anywhere, except one silver frame facing the window. It showed a younger Matteo standing beside a cheerful man who shared his dark eyes but none of his seriousness. Clara had never asked who he was. Matteo caught her looking. "My brother. Leo." The name changed the whole room. 9 years earlier, Leo Viscari had died in an attack meant for Matteo. Leo had been 28, loud, reckless, the only person in the family who could mock Matteo without fear. He used to sit in Matteo's chair, copy his voice, and declare ordinary objects enemies of the family. Clara's little performance had sounded painfully familiar. She hadn't made Mateo laugh because she was unusually funny. For one careless second, she had brought his brother back into the room. Clara's expression softened. "I'm sorry." Mateo looked at her. This apology was different. She wasn't apologizing for the chair anymore. She was apologizing for opening a door she hadn't known existed. Mateo told her that Leo had been laughing minutes before the attack. Leo had convinced Mateo to switch cars, then climbed into the vehicle meant for him. Ever since that night, laughter had felt like evidence of a survival Mateo didn't deserve. Clara didn't tell him to move on. She didn't say Leo would want him to be happy. She simply said grief had a cruel habit of turning every good feeling into a betrayal. Mateo studied her. "How would you know?" Clara looked down at the notebook in her hands. Humor was how she'd survived years of unpaid bills, her father's failing print shop, and mornings when she worked 2 jobs before ever walking into Mateo's office. "If I stopped laughing every time life hurt," she said, "life would be the only one enjoying itself." Mateo looked back at the photograph. For the first time, the silence between them didn't feel like fear. Then the intercom clicked on. Victor Hale, Mateo's senior advisor, announced that an emergency order had already gone out to shut down one of the company's warehouses and lay off 30 workers. Mateo turned sharply. He had issued no such order. Clara pulled up the scheduling file. The document carried Mateo's name, his approval code, and instructions supposedly dictated during a meeting that had never even taken place. This wasn't the first mismatch she'd noticed. It was just the first time she'd been brave enough to say something. Mateo read the order twice. Then he looked at Clara, the secretary who had just made him laugh for the first time in 9 years, and uncovered a command issued in his own name. "Close the door," he said. This time, Clara knew he wasn't planning to fire her. Someone inside Mateo's empire had been speaking with his voice, and Clara might be the only person organized enough to prove it. Mateo canceled the warehouse closure before 30 people lost their jobs. Then he asked Clara to pull every instruction issued under his name over the past year. Nobody outside that private office knew why. All they knew was that Mateo Viscari had laughed for the first time in 9 years, and the secretary responsible was still very much alive. By lunchtime, rumors had spread across all 7 floors. Some employees believed Clara had become Mateo's closest advisor. Others whispered that she had dangerous information. Daniel, the junior accountant she'd saved, quietly left a coffee on her desk with a note. Asterisk, "Thank you for saving my job and surviving the chair." Asterisk. Clara smiled and went back to the files. The forged warehouse order wasn't a one-time mistake. She found canceled medical benefits Mateo had never approved. Suppliers dropped without any meeting. Employees transferred right after questioning suspicious expenses. Every single order carried his authorization code, but Clara managed his calendar. She knew exactly where he'd been when each supposed decision was made. One order had apparently been approved while Mateo was attending a funeral. Another claimed he dictated instructions mid-flight, while his phone was locked inside the plane's safe. Someone was using his reputation to make sure nobody ever asked questions. Victor Hale walked into Clara's office without knocking. He had advised the Viscari family for nearly 15 years and wore loyalty like it was part of his expensive suit. He asked why she was pulling archived records outside her authority. Clara said Mateo had authorized the review. Victor smiled, but the warmth never reached his eyes. He suggested that making the boss laugh had confused her about her place. Secretaries manage calendars. They don't investigate executive decisions. Clara closed the folder in front of her. "Then it's a good thing I'm checking calendars." Victor's expression tightened. He warned her that Mateo's grief had made him vulnerable to anyone offering comfort at the right moment. Clara understood exactly what he was doing. He wanted her to believe that Mateo's laughter had made her dangerous. Before leaving, Victor advised her not to mistake one unusual morning for real influence. Clara waited for the door to close, then quietly wrote down the exact time of his visit. Organization wasn't dramatic, but it was often how quiet people survived powerful ones. That afternoon, Mateo called the warehouse supervisor directly. The man could barely speak at first, convinced he was about to be punished. Mateo explained that the closure order hadn't come from him, and asked what had actually happened. The supervisor admitted that Victor's office had been pressuring him for months to switch to a more expensive transport company. When he refused, the closure order appeared. Mateo looked at Clara. She didn't celebrate being right. 30 families had nearly lost their income because everyone was too afraid to confirm one command. Mateo announced a company-wide policy. No major dismissal, closure, or transfer would be valid without direct confirmation from his office, plus a second executive signature. Victor objected immediately. He claimed the change would make Mateo look uncertain. Mateo replied that fixing a weakness wasn't uncertainty. Letting someone else speak with his voice, that was. Would you expose Victor the moment the pattern became suspicious? Or would you quietly gather stronger proof before confronting someone that powerful? That evening, Clara stayed late comparing approval times against Mateo's calendar. He walked in carrying 2 coffees and set one in her office. She eyed the cup suspiciously. Did you make this yourself? No. Good. I'm not ready to die for company loyalty. Mateo almost laughed again. This time he didn't stop the smile. Clara noticed the guilt still flickered in his eyes when it happened, but it no longer completely erased the warmth underneath. Mateo admitted that Leo used to mock him for drinking his coffee without sugar. According to Leo, bitterness shouldn't be a personality trait and a beverage at the same time. Clara said his brother sounded like a sensible man. He was unbearable. You miss him. Every day. For years, Mateo had only spoken about Leo during security briefings or family memorials. Admitting that he simply missed him felt far harder. Clara didn't offer him a lesson about grief. She just kept sorting documents into piles and let him talk when he was ready. Eventually, Mateo asked why she'd never mentioned her father's printing business. Clara explained the shop had survived 30 years before bad contracts and rising debt nearly closed it down. She'd worked several jobs to help, but refused to ask Mateo for money because she wanted a job, not a rescue. He respected that. Then he asked what she actually wanted from her career. Clara said she wanted to catch problems before executives turned them into emergencies. Mateo glanced at the files stacked around her. You seem qualified. It wasn't a promotion. But it was the first time he'd looked past the word secretary. Near midnight, Clara discovered that most of the forged orders had come from the same executive terminal, Victor's private office. She printed the access history and went to tell Mateo. His office was empty. On his desk sat a brand new document, carrying his digital approval. Clara Bennett, immediate dismissal. The order was set to activate at 8 o'clock the next morning. At the bottom, Victor had added a reason. Asterisk, emotional manipulation of executive leadership. Asterisk. Clara heard the private elevator open behind her. Victor stepped into the office. He looked at the dismissal order, then at the evidence clutched in her hands. You should have stayed behind your desk, he said. Clara tightened her grip on the files. I did. She raised the access report. That's exactly where I found you. Victor stood between Clara and the private elevator. The forged dismissal order still sat on Mateo's desk, carrying an approval code Clara already knew was fake. Victor held out one hand toward the access report. He warned her that taking confidential records from an executive terminal could mean a lot more than losing her job. Clara kept the papers pressed to her chest. You created an order to fire me from Mateo's own office while he wasn't even here. Victor smiled calmly. He claimed Mateo had become emotionally unstable ever since laughing in front of the staff, and that Clara's presence was distracting him from decisions that required discipline. Clara understood exactly what he was doing. If she got scared or angry, Victor would use that reaction as proof she was manipulative. So instead, she stepped toward Mateo's desk phone and pressed one button. The call connected straight to the conference room upstairs. Mateo answered. Clara told him Victor was standing in his office, right beside a forged dismissal order. Victor's smile vanished. Mateo arrived less than a minute later. He read the document, checked the approval time, and asked Victor exactly where it had come from. Victor claimed the executive system had generated it after several department heads complained about Clara's influence. Mateo asked for their names. Victor had none. Then Clara placed the terminal access report on the desk. Every forged instruction had come from Victor's office. Mateo could have removed him on the spot. Instead, Victor pushed back, claiming access logs could be altered, accusing Clara of manufacturing evidence to secure a powerful position for herself. The accusation was believable enough to plant doubt. Mateo looked at Clara. She didn't ask him to trust her blindly. She asked him to verify everything. That answer mattered. The next morning, Mateo gathered every department head into the main conference room. For years, Victor had done the talking in these meetings while Mateo sat silently at the end of the table. Employees rarely questioned orders, because his silence seemed to confirm them. This time Mateo spoke directly. He explained that orders had gone out without his knowledge, and asked anyone affected to speak up. Nobody moved. Fear had become part of the company's foundation. Then Daniel, the junior accountant, raised his hand. He admitted Victor had ordered him to falsify supplier figures, and warned that Mateo would fire him if he refused. A warehouse supervisor spoke next. Then the head of human resources revealed that employee benefits had been canceled through orders carrying Mateo's name. Every single person in that room had believed the cruelty came from him. Mateo listened without interrupting. Clara watched the truth hit him harder than anger ever could. His own reputation had made Victor's lies possible. When the meeting ended, Mateo apologized to the employees. The room went completely silent. Nobody expected a man like Mateo Viscari to admit failure. He told them that fear might create obedience, but it had also killed honest communication. From that day forward, any employee could request written confirmation of major orders without fear of punishment. Victor watched from the doorway. His grip on the company was starting to slip. Would you forgive Mateo for the silence that let others suffer? Or do you believe a leader has to answer for every order made in his name, even ones he never gave? That evening, Clara found Mateo alone in Leo's old office. Nothing inside had changed in 9 years. A deck of cards still sat on the desk, along with a ridiculous framed certificate declaring Leo the company's chief director of unnecessary opinions. Mateo explained that Leo had made it himself after interrupting a serious meeting. Clara smiled. She said Leo would probably be disappointed that Mateo let Victor become the only person allowed to have opinions around here. Mateo almost argued. Then he laughed softly, and this time he didn't punish himself for it. Clara noticed. Mateo admitted that every laugh still felt like leaving his brother behind. Clara picked up the certificate. Maybe this is how he comes with you. The words settled quietly between them. Mateo asked if she was afraid of Victor. Yes. Her honesty caught him off guard. But fear doesn't mean he's right. Mateo stepped closer and promised she'd be protected. Clara immediately corrected him. She didn't want guards trailing her through every hallway. She wanted access to the records, the authority to question orders, and the right to speak without being dismissed as emotionally involved. Mateo agreed. He appointed her temporary operations coordinator for the internal review, not as a reward for making him laugh, but because her scheduling records had exposed the entire problem. Clara only accepted after insisting the appointment be documented and reviewed by the board. You make promotions unnecessarily difficult, Mateo said. You make everything sound like a threat. His smile lingered a little longer this time. Over the following days, Clara cross-checked vendor records, meeting schedules, and staff statements. The pattern went far beyond the false dismissals. Victor had been redirecting company contracts toward businesses he secretly controlled. He hadn't just used Mateo's name to punish employees. He'd stolen millions while making Mateo look responsible for it. Clara prepared the evidence for the leadership meeting. Hours before the presentation, every screen inside Viscari Holdings lit up with a private video. It showed Clara sitting in Mateo's chair, mocking his voice while employees laughed. Victor had edited out the frightened accountant, and Clara's attempt to comfort him. A message appeared underneath. Asterisk, the secretary who turned grief into entertainment now controls the company. Asterisk. Employees stared as Clara crossed the lobby. Reporters had already gathered outside. Victor had twisted the one moment that brought Mateo back to life into proof that Clara had humiliated a grieving man. The board called an emergency meeting. And this time, Clara would have to prove that Mateo's laughter hadn't made him weak, or made her powerful enough to manipulate him. The emergency board meeting began beneath a screen still playing that edited video, Clara in Mateo's chair, employees laughing around her. It never showed Daniel's panic, or Clara trying to save a terrified junior accountant from humiliation. Victor sat at the far end of the table. He described Clara as an ambitious secretary who discovered Mateo's grief, made herself emotionally indispensable, and used that leverage to worm her way into executive decisions. Several board members glanced at Mateo. For 9 years, his silence had ended every argument in the room. This time silence would only help Victor. So Clara stood before anyone could speak for her. She explained exactly why she'd sat in that chair. Daniel had entered one wrong number, and genuinely believed Mateo would destroy his future over it. Clara had used humor to break through his fear. She admitted the impression had been inappropriate, but inappropriate humor didn't create false closure orders, steal company contracts, or cancel employee benefits. Victor claimed she was changing the subject. Clara placed 12 folders on the table. Each one contained an order issued under Mateo's name, the exact time it was created, and proof that Mateo had been somewhere else entirely. One document claimed he'd approved a supplier change while attending Leo's memorial. Another had been created while his executive terminal was disconnected for maintenance. Every single order traced back to Victor's office. Victor dismissed the records as technical errors. Then Daniel walked in. He testified that Victor had ordered him to falsify supplier numbers and threatened him with Mateo's wrath if he refused. The warehouse supervisor followed, then the HR director, then 3 employees who'd been transferred after questioning suspicious payments. Victor turned to Mateo. "Are you really going to let a handful of frightened workers and one secretary tear apart 15 years of loyalty?" Mateo finally stood. He didn't start by accusing Victor. He addressed the employees directly. 4 years, he said. He'd believed fear kept the company disciplined. Instead, it had let another man borrow his voice, because nobody felt safe enough to confirm the truth. "The orders weren't mine," Mateo said. "But the silence that made them believable, that was." Clara watched the board take that in. Mateo wasn't dodging responsibility just because Victor had committed the fraud. He was owning the environment that let it happen. Victor pointed at the video again, insisting Clara had weakened him. Mateo looked at the frozen image of her sitting in his chair. Then he told the entire room why he'd laughed. He talked about Leo, the brother who used to mock his seriousness, sit in that same chair, and die in a car meant for him. Clara had known none of that when she did her impression. Her joke hadn't exploited his grief. It had reminded him that grief had run every room in his life for far too long. "Laughing didn't make me weak," Mateo said. "It made me realize how much authority I'd surrendered to silence." Would you respect Mateo more for admitting his failure in public? Or do you believe a powerful leader should never show that kind of weakness? Victor demanded a vote to dismiss Clara before the investigation went any further. Clara cut him off. She didn't ask the board to keep her because Mateo trusted her. She asked them to judge her work, nothing else. She laid out the vendor trail. 3 transport companies receiving inflated contracts, all sharing the same legal address. The profits flowed through a private trust controlled by Victor. The stolen total exceeded $8 million. Nobody spoke. Victor's confidence finally cracked. He accused Clara of digging through private financial records without authority. Mateo placed her written appointment as temporary operations coordinator on the table, approved by the board 3 days earlier. Clara had stayed exactly within her role. Victor had simply never imagined a secretary would understand the system better than he did. The board suspended him on the spot and ordered an independent audit. Security collected his access cards. Mateo didn't threaten him, didn't order any private punishment. He let the legal process take over. After the meeting, Clara found Mateo standing alone beside Leo's photograph. He admitted that speaking about his brother in public had felt like tearing open an old wound in front of strangers. Clara asked if he regretted it. No. For the first time, Leo's memory had entered the room without ending every good feeling inside it. Mateo thanked Clara, not for making him laugh, but for refusing to let Victor twist what that laughter meant. She reminded him that he had defended her without ever speaking for her. "I'm learning," he said slowly. His smile came back. Then the lights cut out. Emergency power kicked in seconds later. Mateo's head of security walked in carrying a file recovered from Victor's private safe, an insurance report from the attack that killed Leo. Victor had kept it buried for 9 years. The report showed that someone inside the organization had changed Mateo's vehicle assignment 1 hour before the explosion. The authorization code belonged to Victor. The financial fraud was no longer his worst secret. Victor might have exploited Mateo's grief for years, because he'd helped create it. The hidden report proved Victor had switched the vehicle assignment an hour before the blast. But it didn't yet prove why. Mateo wanted Victor dragged back in immediately. For 9 years he had lived believing Leo died simply because he picked the wrong car. Clara stopped him before grief turned into an order. If you punish him before the truth is complete, he dies calling himself innocent. Mateo's hands tightened around the report. Clara reminded him that Victor had survived for years by turning fear into silence. The only real defeat was making every fact public. Mateo agreed. Security handed the report, vehicle logs, and Victor's financial records over to independent investigators. The audit uncovered payments made days before the attack to a mechanic tied to one of Victor's shell companies. That mechanic had altered the vehicle schedule and planted the explosive. The original target had always been Mateo. Victor believed Leo's death would leave Mateo broken enough to depend on him completely. He'd been right. For 9 years, Victor made decisions Mateo no longer had the strength to question. Every stolen contract, every forged order, all of it grew out of the grief Victor himself had planted. Victor was charged with fraud, conspiracy, and involvement in Leo's death. Mateo attended the formal hearing but said nothing to him directly. Victor tried one last time to provoke him. "You became powerful because I removed your weakness." Mateo looked at the man who had stolen his brother, then used the wound as a doorway into his empire. "Leo was never my weakness." He walked away without giving Victor the violent ending he'd clearly been hoping for. The investigation recovered most of the stolen funds. Employees whose benefits had been canceled were compensated, and every dismissal connected to Victor's forged orders was reviewed. Mateo tore down the old leadership structure and replaced it with written approvals, independent audits, and direct employee access to executive decisions. He no longer believed fear was proof of loyalty. Clara's temporary role ended when the investigation closed. The board then opened a permanent senior operations position. Clara applied like every other candidate. She presented the system she'd built for verifying orders, protecting employees, and making sure no single office could ever control every approval again. She won the position unanimously. Mateo didn't vote. He wanted nobody claiming she'd gotten it because she made him laugh, or because something quieter had started growing between them. 3 months later, the company gathered for Leo's memorial. In past years, Mateo had stood beside the photograph, said 2 formal sentences, and left before anyone could bring up how Leo had actually lived. This time, he carried the ridiculous certificate from Leo's old office, Chief Director of Unnecessary Opinions. Mateo told the employees that Leo once interrupted a major meeting, just to warn everyone that the conference table couldn't be trusted. A few people smiled carefully. Then Mateo admitted Leo had blamed the table after losing an argument. Clara laughed first. Mateo followed. The sound wasn't shocked out of him this time. He chose it. Soon the whole room was laughing with him instead of freezing in fear. Mateo looked at Leo's photograph and understood. Happiness didn't erase grief. It just gave the memory somewhere warm to live. Later that evening, Clara walked into Mateo's office and found his chair empty. She sat down in it. When Mateo appeared in the doorway, she lowered her voice dramatically. The quarterly report is 2 pages longer than expected. Clearly, the finance department has declared war. Mateo crossed his arms. "Are you mocking me again?" "No. I'm checking whether the chair has developed better leadership skills." He laughed. This time, nobody outside the office even stopped working. The sound had finally become part of the building. Mateo walked over to the desk and asked if Clara would have dinner with him. Is this an executive instruction? A personal request? And if I refuse? I'll pretend the chair advised against it. Clara looked at him for a long moment, then agreed. Matteo offered his hand as she stood. 9 years earlier, Victor had taken Leo's life and convinced Matteo that laughter belonged to the dead. Clara never replaced his brother. She never repaired his grief. She simply refused to let pain speak with Matteo's voice forever. And the Mafia boss who once terrified an entire empire with silence finally discovered that being heard was not the same thing as being feared. Sometimes it all starts with one impossible secretary sitting in the wrong chair and reminding him how to laugh again.